Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another live streaming of Basic Transfer Pricing. I would like to say thank you sa ating pong mga subscribers. Umabot na tayo ng 449 subscribers. No? Thank you very much. And gusto ko sana ito na yung last part ng Coca-Cola. But as I go further and as I read further ng Coke, no, napaka-interesting po ng topics. Kasi hindi talaga siya kakayanin, no? Na tatapusin siya ngayon. We will miss some of the facts na importante sa transfer pricing. Kasi ang i-discuss po natin ngayon, yun yung paano nagkaroon na ng findings or mga issues ang IRS, no? Dito sa case ng transfer pricing. And just para sa mga ibang hindi talaga nasusundan yung ating discussion, no? Just an overview of the Coca-Cola, this case, no? The Coca-Cola company, no? So, yung the Coca-Cola company, kilala siya na brand sa buong mundo, no? The Coca-Cola company is a parent company based in Atlanta, Georgia. So, siya yung owner of the intangibles ng Coca-Cola. Ano itong Coca-Cola? Ano yung mga intangibles ng Coca-Cola? Yung kanyang patent, copyrights, yung kanyang design, logo, yung trademark niya, at saka yung secret formula niya sa paggawa po ng soft drinks, no? So, the Coca-Cola company, ni-license niya ang intangibles niya kay supply points, no? So, itong mga supply points, sila itong mga controlled foreign corporations na nagmamanufacture at nagbebenta ng concentrate. Ang concentrate, ito yung nilalagyan na ng tubig at ginagawa ng soft drinks, nilalagay na sa bote, no? Tapos ito namang si supply point, siya ang nagsusupply sa butlers, no? Sino itong mga butlers? Sila naman yung nag-manufacture, nagdi-distribute ng products using the intangibles. Ano itong mga intangibles? Yun yung bote ng Coke, ginagamit na nila, yung concentrate, nilalagyan na nila ng tubig, pinaprocess na into soft drinks, tapos ginagamit na nila yung marketing intangibles, logo, brands, no? Si supply points, nagbabayad siya ng royalty kay Coca-Cola. Si butlers naman, hindi, no? Ginagamit lang niya yung mga intangibles ni Coca-Cola pero hindi siya nagbabayad. Saan niya sinasama yung bayad niya? Sa pagbili niya ng concentrate, no? So, si the Coca-Cola company, meron siyang mga companies, no? Yung Coca-Cola Export, yun yung nagmamayari ng mga service companies, no? Sino naman itong mga service companies na to? Sila yung gumagawa ng mga local advertising in country consumer marketing, no? Sila yung liaison with the local butlers, sila yung some na mga service companies, meron pa silang research and development, no? And sila yung tumutulong sa mga independent butlers para mag-market ng Coca-Cola products, no? Na sila yung isa ng marketing. Okay. So, in the course ng kanilang operations, may mga agreements itong mga related parties na to, no? So, yung related parties, saan siya umiikot? From the time na meron silang ginawa na pangalan at saka mga patent, no? Logo, trademarks. Ito yung owned by the Coca-Cola Company based in Atlanta, Georgia. Yung sumunod dyan, ito yung mga supply points na gumagawa ng concentrate at binibigay, sinusupply nila sa mga independent butlers para itong mga butlers na to gagawin nilang soft drinks. But along the way, ang dami pa nilang mga ginagawang mga companies sa iba't ibang mga regions all over the world, sila yung nagpapatakbo ng Coca-Cola. But lahat po ng related parties na yan, under siya ng the Coca-Cola Company, which is headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. No? So, sa in conducting transfer pricing analysis dito sa transfer pricing audit, the Internal Revenue Service ng US, ang ginamit nila is the comparative profit method, no? And then may in-employ sila na isang industry expert, no, si Dr. Nyolon, at ang ginamit nila na ratio is the return on assets, no? So we have shown to you yung last nasusundan mo ba, Hari? Sino-show mo ba yung pages?
Yung ngayon, ma'am, i-ano sa kayo na tapos
Ano mo sa 1112?
1-1.
1112, no? So, balikan natin yun. Kasi, yung ginamit ng expert hired by the US, patayin mo na yung aircon kasi masakit na sa mata. Okay. No, so yung ginamit po ng expert na ratio para malaman kung how is the result of operation ng Coca-Cola is the return on assets. Why? Because yung Coca-Cola, yung operation ng Coca-Cola is asset intensive. Bakit siya asset intensive? Kasi para makabuo ka ng Coca-Cola, you have to use different assets, machineries, no? And then sa pag-deliver mo, gagamit ka ng mga transportation equipment. So asset intensive po ang manufacturing. So ang ginamit nila is the ratio ng return on assets, no? At sa page 112, andyan na yung profitability of supply points versus global industry comparison. But before that, shout out muna tayo. Ilan na yung nanonood sa atin?
May viewers na po, madam, na 6 viewers.
Okay, so we have 6 viewers pero walang shout out.
Wala pa po.
Okay, so but shout out po tayo sa ating mga viewers, no? Good evening and thank you for watching, no? So tuloy lang po tayo kasi alam nyo, filing season na, no? Ang sabi ko sana, no, sa kasi ang dami ng mga rush na trabaho, sabi ko wag na muna tayo mag-live streaming, no? But siguro kaya pa naman baka itong February, but yung March and April natin, no, mag-resume na lang tayo ulit pagdating na ng May, no? Kasi hindi po kaya pagka yung araw na at saka maraming clients, no? Nakakahilo. Just entertaining the clients na nag-inquire na gano, hilong-hilo ka na no? So we'll continue siguro itong buong February and reminder na rin para doon sa sa ating mga participants sa free seminar, 2-day seminar for the tax preparer. Ilan na yung nag-enroll sa atin?
335.
Oh, 335 na, just on time for the filing ng income tax return, no? So we have a free seminar for tax preparers, and in there, you will learn about how to prepare different kind of financial statements for different kind of taxpayers, just like manufacturing companies, just like non-stock non-profit organization, cooperatives, no, magkaiba yan. And first and most important is the disclosure to the notes of financial statements, because yan yung nape-penalize tayo ng SEC, no? So, muntik-muntik ka na kung hindi makakuha ng accreditation sa SEC because may mga findings yung SEC about the notes to financial statements at saka yung mga disclosures, no? So, buti na lang na natin na explain yung mga reasons. So, pero kung hindi talaga tayo mabigyan ng accreditation. And that's one of the reason is the yung hindi angkop yung disclosure natin sa financial statements. That's why pag-usapan natin yan, i-discuss natin yan sa inyo, no? Para tama yung ating mga disclosures to financial statements. Okay. So let's go back to how the IRS examine or audit the Coca-Cola company, no? So they use the return on assets. Why return on assets? Kasi tiningnan nila yung assets ng mga company, yung supply point, ha. Kasi itong supply point, sila yung gumagawa ng concentrate. Itong concentrate, ito yung kung baga sa ano, may timpla na yung ingredients ng Coke, lalagyan na lang nila ng tubig, no? So, yung concentrate na yan, ang nagsusupply niyan, itong mga supply point, no, na sinusupply nila doon sa bottlers. At ang bottlers naman, ang naglalagay niyan sa mga bote para makapunta na sa consumer, no? So, ang supply points, yung mga gumagawa ng concentrate, tiningnan nila at using the comparable profit method, no? So, anong tiningnan nila dito? The gross profit, no? Ilan yung kinuha nila na mga companies based on the industry analysis, no? 996, to, 996 companies that included the Pepsi-Cola company, yun yung number 1 niya na kalaban, the Nestle, the major brewing companies, bottlers, and virtually every other major food or beverage manufacturer worldwide. Ang scope dito ng study is worldwide na because worldwide ang operation ng Coke, no? So, yung ginamit na return on assets, this is for 2007 and 2009, which is the years under transfer pricing audit. And it was found out na 252, no, of the 996 companies that were subjected to analysis ng kanilang profitability, no, gross profit. 252, 10% lang, no, ang profitability niya. Okay. Gross profit margins, okay. Yung 170, 15%, 123, 20%, 25% naman 69 companies, 30% 33 companies, 35% 36 companies, 40% 16 companies, and so on. But if you try to look at yung return on assets ng supply point ng Coke, ang Mexican supply point niya 94%, no? Sobra-sobra. Biro mo yung return on assets niya, ibig sabihin sobra-sobra yung kanyang income earned during the year. Yung company, yung parent company, the Coca-Cola, based in Atlanta, Georgia, ito yung nandoon yung general headquarter nila sa Atlanta, Georgia, the Coca-Cola company, has 53%, no? 53% yung kanyang return on assets. Samantalang yung Mexican supply point, 94%, the Swazi supply point, 128%, yung Costa Rican supply point niya, 143%, ang Chilean supply point, ito yung dito nag-adjust ang IRS, no? Kasi yung Chilean supply point niya 148%, Brazilian supply point 179%, and the Irish supply point 214%. And remember, itong mga companies na to na supply points, they contribute 85% of the total sales ng Coca-Cola based on their region, no? So, anong ginawa ng IRS? They treated yung excess na return on assets or yung kita, yung profit ng supply points, tinrit nila as payment of royalty. Na dapat, payment of royalty yan sa the Coca-Cola Company based in Georgia, Atlanta, but since related parties lang sila, para hindi siya matax sa US, kasi mataas ang tax rate ng US compared dito sa mga supply points company na subsidiary din ng Coke. So doon nila nilagay yung kanilang profit, no? Kaya sobrang laki ng profit nila. Ang doon naman sa Coca-Cola Georgia, maliit lang, no? So anong ginawa ng IRS? Pina-adjust yung income. Paano pina-adjust yung income? Binawasan yung sobra-sobrang profit nitong mga companies na to at tinrate siya na dapat royalty payment siya sa Coca-Cola. Bakit? Because the Coca-Cola company in US, siya yung may-ari ng lahat ng intangibles. So why is it na itong supply points, concentrate lang ang sinusupply, sobrang laki ng profits. So ang contention ng US IRS is that payment yun para sa Coca-Cola company, owner of the intangibles, na doon lang ni-remit, doon lang binigay sa supply points or sa mga subsidiaries. So, pina-adjust, no? So, very conservative yung kanilang adjustment. Pati na yung pagbigay nila ng comparative profit method, no? Okay. Anong justification nila? The reasonableness of the comparable profit analysis method. May shoutout na, Hari?
Wala pa po.
Okay, so ilan na yung viewers natin?
5 viewers.
Okay. So, anong sinasabi po dito sa reasonableness of the CPM or the comparative profit analysis, no? So, it has been shown that the choice of transfer pricing method is largely driven by the question, who in the group owns the valuable non-routine intangibles, no? So, sino ba yung mga may-ari ng intangibles sa group? Kasi bakit? Kung nasa inyo yung intangibles, value drivers yan ng business, and you are the owner, dapat malaki yung kita mo kasi ikaw yung papagalaw ng ibang mga branches mo or mga subsidiaries mo, no? So, intangible assets, especially unique intangibles of the kind involved here, tend to defy easy evaluation for at least 3 reasons. First, they derive their high value from their ability to exclude comparable external transactions. See United States versus E.I. DuPont, Dinnemors and Company, no? Second, the value of such intangible is not easily delimited from the taxpayer's complementary business assets. Third, the profit potential of such intangible is not reliably tethered to any cost of other input, no? So, the value in the eye of the beholder. The valuation of intangibles for transfer pricing purposes, no? So, where controlled transactions implicate high-value intangibles, therefore, 116. Okay. The valuation of intangibles for transfer pricing purposes, where controlled transactions implicate high-value intangibles, the most reliable transfer pricing method is often one that avoids any direct valuation of those intangibles. So, any direct valuation of the intangibles, yun yung ina-avoid, no? And the choice among indirect methods typically depends on who owns the intangibles. So, sino bang owner ng intangibles dito? Bakit maliit lang yung kita niya as compared to the companies na supply company lang sila, no? So, the profit split method will often be appropriate where both controlled taxpayers contribute significant intangible property. Income tax regulations. By contrast, the comparable profit method will often be preferred where only one of two entities contributes meaningful intangible property. Okay. So the case is particularly susceptible to a cost comparable profit method analysis because petitioner owned virtually all the intangible assets needed to produce and sell the company's beverages. Sino yung owner? The Coca-Cola company based in Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, no? So petitioner was the registered owner of virtually all trademarks covering the Coca-Cola, Fanta, and Sprite brands, and the most valuable trademarks covering the company's other products. Petitioner was the registered owner of nearly all of the company's patents, including patents covering aesthetic designs, packaging materials, beverage ingredients, and production processes. No? So, ito yung justification ng IRS kung bakit the comparable profit method is the most preferred method, no? In this case. 117 na, Hari. Petitioner owned all rights to the company's secret formulas and proprietary manufacturing protocols. Petitioner owned all intangible property resulting from the company's research and development concerning new products, ingredients, and packaging. Petitioner was the counterparty to all Butler agreements, giving it ultimate control over the distribution system for the company's beverages. And most SERVCO agreements executed after 2003 explicitly provided that any marketing concepts developed by third-party vendors are the property of export. Sino itong export? Ito yung Coca-Cola export, which is wholly owned also by the Coca-Cola company. Thus, cementing petitioners' ownership of marketing intangibles subsequently developed outside the United States. No? The supply points owned few valuable intangibles. Kasi ano lang sila gumagawa lang sila ng concentrate. At yung owner ng intangibles na ginagamit nila in manufacturing the concentrates owned by Coca-Cola company. So the agreements with petitioner explicitly acknowledge that TCC owned the company's trademarks, giving the supply points only a limited right to use petitioner IP in connection with manufacturing and distributing concentrate. 4 supply points, including the Irish supply points. Yung Irish, di ba yun yung pinakamataas ang gross profit, no? Should 0 trademarks. No, wala naman siyang trademarks. Bakit? 200+% yung kanyang gross profit, no? Or other intangible assets on their balance sheet. So, overpaid siya. Yun ang contention ng Coca-Cola. Overpaid yung Irish because sobrang laki ng kanyang profit, pero niwalaan siyang intangibles at 0 yung trademarks niya. No? None of the other supply points develop significant intangibles in-house. No? So, wala naman silang dine-develop na intangibles. Only the Brazilian supply point showed meaningful IP, intangible property. But its IP of $190 million, yan ang valuation, attributable largely to locally owned beverage brands. Butler franchise rights and goodwill represented just 11% of its total assets. So yung kanyang intellectual property, 11% of its total assets. Why? Kasi if you try to look at ano ba yung mga composition or components ng assets, so nandyan na yung mga machineries, no, used in manufacturing, the equipments. So the supply points agreements with petitioner granted them rights to produce and sell concentrate. And petitioner refers to these rights as franchise rights. Sino may franchise rights dito? The supply points. Why? Because sila yung nagdi-distribute ng concentrate, no? They produce and distribute concentrate. But remember that these supply points are also owned by Coca-Cola. No? These agreements were terminable by petitioner at will. Actually, umiikot tayo dito sa mga companies na to for taxation purposes lang. Why? It has no bearing with the management of Coca-Cola per se. Why? Kasi lahat ng companies na to siya yung may-ari. No? Kaya walang bearing sa kanya lahat. Ang may bearing lang ito because of the tax that should be collected by whom? No? By the tax authorities. At sino na yung tax authorities na yan? Kasi situated siya in different parts of the world. No supply point enjoyed any form of territorial exclusivity, and no supply point was granted any right, expressed or implied, to guaranteed production of concentrate. No? Bali, wala naman sa kanila eh. Why? Kasi sila naman nagpapatakbo, sila yung nagmamanage, and they owned it. No? Pero for tax purposes, yun na nga, the transfer pricing or the arm's length principle will come in. The impermanence of their rights was demonstrated in practice. From 1986 through 2009, TCCC closed or shifted production away from 18 supply points. No? Biro mo, nag-shift siya ng production from the supply points, but no supply point received any compensation for their loss of production and income. No? Hindi sila nanghingi ng compensation for the loss of income. No? So, tinanggal na sa kanila yung supply point sa pag manufacture at distribution ng concentrate. We find no factual support for the assertion that the supply points owned valuable intangible assets in the form of franchise rights. So ano yung sabi nila na allegation ng Coke na kaya daw malaki ang binabayad sa supply points because of their intangible assets na franchise rights. But if you try to look at their dealings or what is manifested in their dealings is hindi protected yung franchise rights or yung supply points that's not owned or enjoyed additional revenue for its franchise rights, no? Hindi protected. The Coca-Cola system is an extremely, ito yung gusto kong marinig, no? The Coca-Cola system is an extremely sophisticated and complex operation. No? Complicated yung operation niya. But sometimes they complicate it talaga for some reason, no? But nearly all of its complexity is external to the supply points, no? So ano sabi dito? Coca-Cola is extremely sophisticated and complex operation. Pero it is external to supply points. Bakit external to supply points? Kasi ang trabaho ng supply points simple lang, no? Just manufacture the concentrate and then distribute that concentrate to the licensed bottler. Hindi rin naman siya pwedeng distribute ng mga concentrate na yun to the unlicensed or to the independent bottlers. Sa mga licensed bottlers lang din ng Coca-Cola, no? So, they engage in routine manufacturing, mixing ingredients specified by petitioner according to manufacturing protocols supplied by petitioner. In essence, they were wholly owned contract manufacturers. So, sino dito? Kaya, sino tested party dito? The supply point. Bakit? They perform as simple and not complex functions, no? Simple-simple yung ginagawa niya. They are wholly owned contract manufacturers. Pag wholly owned contract manufacturers ka, wala kang risk, no? Kasi contract ka lang, you don't even own the inventories. The CPM or the comparable profit method is ideally suited to this scenario. Kaya nga hindi applicable yung profit split method. The CPM evaluates the profitability only of the tested party. So, sino tested party dito? The supply point. Why the supply point is chosen as the tested party in this transfer pricing case of the Coke? Because the supply point perform the less complex functions. So, here the supply points, and it can thus determine an arm's length profit range for the supply points without attempting a direct valuation of the company's hard-to-value intangible assets. Alam nyo, because of this transfer pricing and because of this ginagawa ko na ngayon that I have to read multiple cases, no, in transfer pricing, and I have to summarize, no? I have to read the long cases, and then you have to summarize, and then you have to highlight the important points. Nahahasa ako pagdating sa transfer pricing audit. Why? Because kung ano nangyari dito, what is being resolved in court are transfer pricing issues. Under these transfer pricing issues arose from the transfer pricing audit, no? So kaya yung paggawa mo na ngayon ng transfer pricing analysis, you can always go back to the cases and paano i-resolve ito, and paano mo i-prepare ngayon yung documentation mo that will fit the purpose, no? That will, ano yung tawag niya na, kung ano yung purpose na dapat meron ka sa documentation na meet niya, no? Serve the purpose of the transfer pricing analysis or documentation, no? Kasi makikita mo ano yung i-cure niya dito, yung transfer pricing issues na hindi arm's length principle yung ino-observe ng dealings between the parties. So in this case, it is manifested in the dealings between the parties. So parang sa akin parang negligible yung role dito ng supply points kasi ano lang siya gagawa lang siya ng concentrate and then i-supply niya doon sa mga bottlers, no, na licensed by the Coca-Cola company. Ang problema lang dito na na-mislook siguro ng management din ng Coke is that binigyan nila napakalaking profit ang supply points company, no? Samantalang yung supply points company are performing less complex or very simple functions. And under the economic rule natin, sa economic substance, di ba, kung sino yung malaki ang risk, malaki ang participation, or complicated ang functions, siya dapat yung may rewards. No? So, bakit itong supply points, napakasimple lang ng role niya, bakit siya pa yung pinakamataas ang income? No? So, dito natalo yung Coca-Cola. Okay? So, the CPM is ideally suited to this scenario. The CPM evaluates the profitability only of the tested party, which in this case is the supply point. No? Here, the supply points, and it can thus determine an arm's length profit range for the supply points without attempting a direct valuation of the company's hard-to-value intangible assets. Kasi wala namang intangible assets ang supply point, no? Sinong owner ng intangibles na dapat yun ang mahal, no? Yun ang dapat mong bayaran na mahal. The Coca-Cola Company based in Atlanta, Georgia. There is a possible wrinkle to the CPM's application where controlled transactions involve multiple controlled taxpayers apart from the tested party. In that event, determining an arm's length profit range for the tested party does not end the inquiry. For the remaining profit must then be divided between the other entities. No? This further step is not difficult here. Putting aside the split invoicing, ito na. Kasi ang another na dito, malaki itong nangyari kasi sa split invoicing eh. Isa pa to na nagpatalo dito sa issue sa Coca-Cola. But this is just an appealed case. May appeal pa to sa Supreme Court. So, depende pa yan. Hindi pa to tapos, no? But very apparent dito kasi kumbaga sa nakalatag ng husto ng ebidensya nyo yung RIRS. And based on my own evaluation in this case, no, nagkulang ang Coca-Cola sa documentation. Ang daming mga issues dito na undocumented, no? So, ano yung mga example? Yung mga contract agreements nila na kulang-kulang ang mga provisions, no? Hindi mo ma-enforce. Why? Kasi kagaya ng sa obligations and contracts, wala siyang provision for payment, no? So, hindi siya enforceable. Split invoicing, ito yung pinakamalaking issue dito, yung ni-split nila yung invoice. Na itong si supply points, siya yung nagsusupply ng concentrate sa the bottlers. Pero, portion lang ng amount for the concentrate ang ini-invoice kay supply point. Yung iba, ini-invoice ng service companies, no? Those service companies, these are another companies created also by Coke to handle the advertisement ng Coca-Cola, local advertisement. So, ano ginawa nila? Ang ibang presyo ng concentrate, in-split nila. Yung iba, pinasok nila kay supply point, yung iba, pinasok nila kay service companies, no? So, that is tantamount to fraud, no? Fraudulent yun. Kasi hindi naman niya sales, bakit doon mo i-invoice sa kanya? Okay. So, ano tong split invoicing allocations? Petitioner and respondent agree that the served cost, ito yung service companies, the other group of controlled taxpayers reserve arm's length compensation for the function they perform. Thus, once the CPM determines an arm's length profit level of the supply points, the residual income is necessarily reallocated to petitioner, the owner of the valuable intangibles. Okay. Petitioner has identified no pricing data for transactions with unrelated parties that involve the transfer of the same intangibles. So, wala sila ipapakita. The trademarks, brand names, logos, patents, secret formulas, and proprietary manufacturing processes used to produce Coca-Cola, Fanta, Sprite, and the company's other brand beverages. So, the reliability of any comparable uncontrolled transaction method is thus considerably reduced here. Once it has been rolled out, the CPM is preferable in principle to the profit split method because petitioner own virtually all of the relevant intangibles. No? Selection of Butler's comparable parties. So, ito naman si Butler. Sino to si Butler's? sila na yung bumibili ng concentrate from supply points, yung supply points ng company, sila yung gumagawa at nagdi-distribute ng concentrate, no? Selection of butlers as comparable parties. Our conclusion that the controlled activity was highly susceptible to comparable profit split analysis does not suffice to show that the commissioner CPM is the best method, no? For ascertaining an arm's length price. Ito yung allegation ng Coca-Cola. Income tax regulations, we must determine next whether the independent Coca-Cola bottlers that the IRS selected are reasonably treated as comparable to the supply points for this purpose. Ang ginamit dito sa Coca-Cola is also internal comparables, no? Kasi ang kinumpare nila yung bottlers na related parties ng Coke and then yung supply points which is another related party. O sila yung pinag-compare. The determination of the degree of comparability between the tested party and the uncontrolled taxpayer. Bakit ang butlers ang ginawa nilang comparables? Kasi ang butlers independent parties, no? Independent parties siya. Hindi siya may contract lang ang Coca-Cola sa kanya pero hindi sila owned ng Coca-Cola, no? Okay. The determination of the degree of comparability between the tested and uncontrolled taxpayer depends upon all the relevant facts and circumstances. Like other transfer pricing methods, the CPM requires consideration of the general comparability factors set forth in Section 1.482-1D Income Tax Regulations. These factors include functions performed, no? Tingnan nyo itong sinasabi dito, these are the comparability factors, no? And balikan lang natin, what are the comparability factors? We have 5 comparability factors. The nature and characteristics of the goods or services, whether intangible or intangible. We have the functions, assets, and risks, economic conditions, business strategies, and contractual terms, no? So yan ang comparability factors na ang daming findings dyan sa mga factors na yan dito sa Coca-Cola, no? So ito yung factors na talagang may mga findings sila, no? The functions performed, the contractual terms, no? So ang dami niyang contracts na signed na or having contracts with the companies na hindi masyado specified yung terms, no? And then the risk, the economic conditions, property employed or transferred. Kaya ang ginamit dito, return on assets, no? Each of these factors must be considered in determining the degree of comparability between taxpayers and the extent to which comparability adjustments may be necessary. So, balikan natin yung kaso. Ano yung kinumpare dito at ano yung nagiging adjustment dito? Di ba yung return on assets, no? So, yun yung ginamit nila na ratio. And then, ano yung in-adjust nila dito? Yung payment ng royalty to the Coca-Cola company, the parent company. Bakit in-adjust? Kasi overpaid ang subsidiary. So, anong ginawa? Pina-adjust ang subsidiary na yung ibang income niya na binayad sa subsidiary should be income by the parent company as payment for the royalty na the Coca-Cola company owned and is exploited by this subsidiaries niya or the supply points, no? At saka na ang kakapagtaka because the supply points perform only simple, less complicated functions, pero siya pa yung pinakamalaki ang bayad, no? Siya pa yung pinakamalaki ang return on assets, no? So kung baga sa hindi mismatch, no? Mismatch yung wala ka namang risk, simple lang yung functions mo, bakit sa iyo napunta yung malaking income, no? Samantalang si parent company, siya lahat yung may-ari ng intangibles, bakit maliit lang yung income na binibigay sa kanya? So, anong findings ng IRS? Anong ni-require? Adjust your income. Yung income na binigay mo sa mga supply points mo should be income of the parent company. So, anong ginawa? In-adjust, dinagdagan yung income ng Coca-Cola ng parent company. For 2007 to 2009, more than 9 billion, no? Approximately 3 billion a year, no? So the CPM is scaled to operating profit, which represents return for the investment of resources and assumptions of risk, no? For this reason, comparability under this method is particularly dependent on resources employed and risk assumed. Moreover, because resources and risk usually are directly related to functions performed, an analysis of functions performed is important in determining the degree of comparability between the tested party and an uncontrolled taxpayer. Other relevant factors include the parties' respective lines of business, the product or service markets involved, the asset composition employed, including the nature and quantity of tangible assets, intangible assets, and working capital, the size and scope of operations, and the stage in business or product cycle. We agree with the Commissioner's conclusion that independent Coca-Cola bottlers serve as appropriate comparable parties for purposes of a CPM or ROA analysis. No? So the bottlers are comparable to the supply points because they operated in the same industry, faced similar economic risk, had similar but more favorable contractual and economic relationships with petitioner, employed in the same manner many of the same intangible assets, no? Petitioner brand names, trademarks, and logos, and ultimately shared the same income stream from sales of petitioner's beverages. The functions performed by the butlers resemble those performed by the supply points, except that the butlers perform those functions at a greater scale. Both sets of companies engage in the manufacture and distribution of products in the non-alcoholic ready-to-drink. Yan yung NARD. Beverage business. Both sets of companies thus engage in the same line of business and ultimately serve the same product markets. The manufacturing activity in both cases was routine, consisting largely of mixing ingredients according to detailed protocols supplied by petitioners. So ano to? Routine yung kanilang trabaho, no? No, sabi niya, mixing ingredients according to detailed protocols, no? Okay. Concluding that the ratio of operating profit to operating assets is an appropriate profit level indicator where the tested party engages in relatively routine manufacturing activities. Kaya nga, mas simple lang yung kanyang functions. Quality control was important to both sets of companies, and they engaged in comparable forms of quality control at the plant level, subject to standards prescribed and inspections conducted by petitioner. The butler's distribution function was more complex and benefited from greater economies of scale. Kasi butlers no? So, unlimited yung kanyang customer. Samantalang yung supply points, gumagawa sila ng concentrate, sino yung customer nila? Only the licensed Coca-Cola bottlers, no? Samantalang Coca-Cola bottlers, ang ginagawa niyang product, Coca-Cola na mismo, sinusupply sa consumer, unlimited ang consumers. No? Kaya nga, greater economies of sales. So, volume ang sinusupplyan ng bottlers. No? The bottlers, sino yung kinukompare dito? Yung supply point at saka yung bottlers. No? Sino yung supply point? Siya yung gumagawa ng concentrate ng Coca-Cola. Sino yung bottlers? Siya yung gumagawa, nagmamanufacture na ng soft drinks ng Coca-Cola at nagbibenta na sa consumer. No? So, bakit sila yung pinili ng mga comparables? Internal. Kasi ang hinahanap dito, also internal, yung profit ng Coca-Cola, saan napunta, saan nila nilagay, saan nila designate yung kita. So, in this case, malaki masyado yung ang daming lamukhari. In this case, ang laki ng binigay nila na profit kay supply point at maliit yung sa parent company. No? Yung sa butler hindi na kasi ang comparable dito butler, no? So hindi na siya hindi na siya inadjust, no? Ang inadjust lang dito yung sa Coca-Cola Company. Bakit? Kasi yun lang naman yung concern ng IRS. And in this example, sino ang nagreklamo dito? The IRS. So, ang butlers, depende na yan sa local tax authority where the butler is situated. Kung gagawa din siya ng sarili niya ng transfer pricing analysis and also collect additional taxes kung mag-adjust siya ng profit, no? So, depende na yan. In this case, hindi siya pinakialaman ng IRS, no? Kasi bakit? IRS is particular with the income of the Coca-Cola company, which is the owner of the intangibles. Here. Sobrang dami ng lamok. Okay. So, the butlers were responsible for securing, retaining, and distributing to thousands of retail customers. Page 123 na. Whereas the supply points distributed to a relatively small number of butlers that had pre-existing contracts with petitioners. So, yun na yun. Mas marami yung sinusupplyan ng butlers compared to the supply point, no? And then the supply point, ang sinusupplyan niya, yung license lang na butlers. In that respect, the butlers would be deserving of a higher ROA than the supply points, no? So, ano dapat? Dapat mas malaki rin yung return on assets ng butlers compared sa supply points, no? So, bakit dito namamayagpag ang supply points? Siya yung malaki ang profit. Ang ibig sabihin lang dito, this is an artificial price management, no? Na hindi naman dapat ang profit na doon sa supply points doon nilagay, no? So yun yung findings ng IRS. So Dr. Newlon's selection of the butlers as comparable parties was to that degree conservative, no? So pinanigan ng korte yung gawa ni Dr. Newlon, which is the expert hired by IRS to make a transfer pricing study. So, pinanigan yung recommendation niya by the court. No? So, with respect to contractual terms, Dr. Newlon's selection of the butlers as comparable was appropriate. No? Appropriate daw. Ito yung tinatawag na internal comparables. But conservative. Formally speaking, the butlers and the supply points operated under similar contracts with petitioner. Pareho silang may contract lang sa petitioner. Both sets of contracts recognize that ECCC owned the trademarks and other IP needed to produce the beverages. The butlers and the supply points enjoyed limited and essentially equivalent rights to use petitioners' IP in carrying out their manufacturing and distribution functions. And the ECCC reserved the rights to terminate both types of agreements on no more than a few months' notice. So pareho silang may kontrata sa the Coca-Cola Company, which is the parent company. Pero magkaiba sila ng functions. Bakit? Kasi yung isa, ang functions niya is manufacturing of concentrates and distribution. Yung isa naman, manufacturing na talaga ng soft drinks. Practically speaking, however, butlers enjoyed more favorable contract terms, no? So yung butlers daw, mas favorable yung contract terms niya. The supply points generally had very short-term contracts that petitioner could and frequently did terminate at will. The contracts gave the supply points no territorial exclusivity. Walang territorial exclusivity ang supply points, and other supply points routinely sold into their home markets. Their contracts afforded them no guarantee production. Walang guarantee production. The record reflects dozens of production shifts among supply points in the decades after 1980. And PCCC closed or shifted production away from at least 18 supply points between 1986 and 2009. No, the supply points had no say in this, with all production shifts being dictated by CPs in Atlanta. No? So the largest butlers, which Dr. Newlon included in his sample, had 10-year contracts with petitioner. Although TCCC reserved the rights to terminate their contracts on short notice, the mutual dependence between the company and its butlers ensured that butler agreements were almost always renewed. No? So, nire-renew yung sa butlers. As CCE, one of the top 3 butlers, CCE, butlers siya, no, stated in its public filings, we believe that our interdependent relationship with TCCC and the substantial cost and disruption to that company that would be caused by non-renewals ensure that these agreements will continue to be renewed, no? Ano yung agreement nila? Continually daw to be renewed. For this reason, most major bottlers, including CCE, Hellenic, and Coca-Cola FEMSA, assigned to their bottling contracts an indefinite useful life, meaning walang expiration, for accounting and financial statement purposes. Indefinite daw. The butler's contracts with petitioner also afforded them a high degree of territorial exclusivity. TCCC's agreements with most butlers included a geographically defined market in which the butler was granted exclusive rights to produce and sell beverages. For legal reasons, explicit exclusivity clauses were generally absent from European butler agreements, but in practice, butlers respected each other's national territories and rarely attempted to sell into them. No? Because the butlers in practice enjoyed more favorable contract terms, both as to duration and exclusivity, the butlers would be deserving of a higher ROA than the supply points. In this respect, Dr. Nyolon's selection of the butlers as comparables was again conservative. No? Kaya di na-justify nila dito bakit ang butlers ang ginawang comparable. No? Kaya sa paggawa ng transfer pricing analysis, it is a must that you really have to make justification in your choice of comparables. No? So in many respects, the butlers and the supply points faced comparable economic conditions. See 1.482, 1D, 1.434 income tax regulations. Both sets of companies engage in the non-alcoholic ready-to-drink beverages, no, or business, with the revenues ultimately dependent on retail sale of the company beverages. They thus face similar risks from economic cycles and the ebb and the flow of consumer demand, no? So ganun naman ang business di ba? Saan ba sumasabay yung paglaki at pagliit ng negosyo mo? Sa consumer demand, no? The butlers selected by Dr. Nyolon, like the supply points, did business on multiple continents, no, all over the world. And Dr. Nyolon segmented the butlers and supply points into corresponding geographic regions, no? So, speaking of segmentation, during the transfer pricing audit, if you try to look at our RAMO 1-2019, which is the transfer pricing audit guidelines natin dito, there are cases wherein the examiner or the BIR will require the taxpayer to prepare a segmented financial statements. Kaya be ready with it. Kaya nga, pag nagtuturo tayo na ngayon sa free bookkeeping natin, sinasabi na natin na maintain your records on per branch, per division, or whatever segment it is na during the transfer pricing audit, you anticipate the examiner will require you to have a segmented financial statements. So, minimizing the risk of non-comparability owing to uniquely local market factors. In determining comparability, we must consider in particular any economic conditions that could affect the prices that would be charged or paid, or the profit that would be earned by the tested party and the uncontrolled comparable. In this regard, we consider, among other things, the extent of competition in its market and the alternatives realistically available to the buyer and seller. The supply points sold concentrate to preordained buyers in a global market where competition was robust. Butlers contracted with TCCC and agreed to purchase concentrate from whichever supply point TCC dictated. Most supply points had unused production capacity. There were no substantial barriers to prevent TCCC or others from quickly building more capacity, and none of the supply points enjoyed any significant local advantage. In other words, the supply points were easily replaceable and regularly were replaced at relatively low cost to petitioner. Indeed, when petitioner shifted concentrate production from one supply point to another, without building a new manufacturing plant, the cost of replacing the losing supply point was virtually zero. No? Pero mo wala siyang cost, no? I-replace mo lang siya, tapos wala kang babayaran, no? So in an arm's length negotiation over price, therefore, the supply points would have occupied a very weak bargaining position vis-a-vis TCCC. Very weak ang supply points, no? It is inconceivable that price could be controlled without power over competition or vice versa. So wala talaga, walang powers ng supply points. Pero yun na nakakapagtaka. Pagdating sa bargaining na wala siyang power. Bakit siya yung may pinakamalaki na return on assets, no? In this respect, the butlers occupied a vastly superior position, no? Yung butlers ang superior ang position because they enjoy de facto territorial exclusivity. Pagka kanila na yung lugar, hindi na pwedeng pumasok yung ibang butlers, no? Exclusive na lang sa kanila. They could restrict the extent of competition for sale of Coca-Cola beverages in their market. Solo nila yung kanilang market, no? So, and because the butlers created and managed their local distribution networks, TCCC had few alternatives realistically available to secure local trade marketing and product placement in stores. Sinong gumagawa niyan? Yung butlers. Collectively, these economic conditions gave the butlers market power in their respective territories. So, powerful sila in their market territories. Yung sakop nila ng teritoryo, no? That enabled them to secure in negotiations with the company an equitable split of system profit. Ano yung equitable split of system profit? Sometimes as high as 55% in the butler's favor. Pero mo, imagine makagawa ka ng gross profit ng 55%, no? 45% lang yung cost mo. That's already very profitable, no? So the supply points had no comparable bargaining point. Samantalang yung supply points, wala siyang bargaining point. Kasi paano siya nagpa-price, paano sa niya dinidistribute, no? Pina-price yung kanyang concentrate. Okay, so we find that the butlers and the supply points were reasonably comparable in terms of resources employed. Both sets of companies manufactured and distributed products in the non-alcoholic, ready-to-drink beverage business, and they used a similar mix of resources to discharge those functions. Kaya comparable sila kasi pareho silang nagmamanufacture and then pareho silang gumagamit ng resources, no? The butlers were generally larger companies and their distribution activities were more complex. They accordingly had many more employees than the supply points. And PPE, no, ano yung PPE? Property, plant, and equipment, consisting of the machineries, the land, no, the mga vehicles, represented a larger percentage of their operating assets. Sino yung mas marami ang operating assets? Si butlers. But the two sets of companies were similar in terms of the relationships between their operating assets and their total resources. No? Okay. The butlers were highly comparable to the supply points in terms of risk assumed. Both sets of companies faced the same risk to capital employed because they used similar resources to perform similar functions uniquely demanded by the non-alcoholic ready-to-drink market. Although Coca-Cola butlers occasionally battled other companies' beverages, their diversification in their respect was minimal. As was true for the supply points, therefore, their profitability ultimately depended on income generated by retail sale of the company's products. Because their employed capital could not easily be redirected to non-company products, let alone to products outside the non-alcoholic ready-to-drink market, the butlers and the supply points faced essentially the same risk associated with the success or failure of the non-alcoholic ready-to-drink beverage business and the company's products in particular. Dr. Nyolon observed, and we agree, that the butlers in some respects assume greater risk than the supply points. The supply points' operating assets include large amounts of cash and accounts receivable from credit-worthy butlers. The butler's operating assets, by contrast, consisted chiefly of illiquid and difficult to repurpose PPE. And the receivables from small retailers were subject to greater collection risk. Sino yung mas maraming risk? Ang butlers, no? Kasi sila yung nagbibenta na or nagtitinda na ng diretso ng soft drinks, no? Even sa mga small retailers. The butlers also bore greater risk as a consequence of their more robust distribution functions. The supply points, in essence, had guaranteed customers. The butlers and TCC dictated the butlers to which their concentrate was sold. The butlers, by contrast, had to require and retain retail customers, no? Secure desirable product placement in stores, and negotiate favorable product pricing, particularly with smaller retailers. The butler's distribution function, as compared with the supply point's distribution functions, entailed greater uncertainty and thus greater risk. Petitioner contends that the supply points bore marketing risk because they funded consumer advertising in foreign markets, but the supply points had no operational responsibility for consumer marketing. They thus bore no risk in the sense of mission failure. Rather, petitioners simply charged certain Servco marketing expenses to the supply points books, and it made these charges roughly concurrently with the supply points receipt of vastly larger amounts of income from the butlers. No? So, petitioner controlled how much revenue each supply point received by shifting concentrate productions among them, and how much expense each supply point was charged by way of DME, direct marketing expenses, and fees and commissions allocated to it. Since the flow of revenue and marketing expenses to the supply points was controlled by TCCC, and since the revenue invariably exceeded the marketing expenses by a very wide margin, we do not see how the supply points bore marketing risk in any realistic sense. So, paano magkakaroon ng marketing expenses na masyadong malaki yung supply points? Eh, yung sinusupplyan niya, mga license na, na butlers, no? Risk is not something that can be assigned after the fact. Kasi hindi mo pwedeng i-assign lang yung risk, eh. Kasi, ang mangyayari dyan, totoo talaga yung risk. Bakit? Kasi in this case, yung supply point, gagawa lang siya, mag-manufacture lang siya. Tapos, ng concentrate, distribute niya doon sa mga license na Coke lang. Hindi naman siya so supply doon sa mga iba't ibang klase ng consumer, no? Ang sinusupplyan niya, license na. So, wala siyang risk, no? So, risk is not something that can be assigned. No? Dr. Newlon acknowledges and the court agrees that the economic position of the supply points and the butlers differed in few respects. No? So, magkaiba sila ng position. Petitioner emphasizes that the two sets of companies occupied different points in the company's supply chain and did business at different levels of the market. Supply points sold concentrate to butlers. Yun yung trabaho ng supply points. And butlers sold finished beverages to distributors and retailers. So magkaiba. But petitioners failed to show how these distinctions affect the comparability of the functions the two sets of companies discharged or the operating profit they could earn. No? So ano sabi ng court? Hindi na show ng Coca-Cola how the distinctions ng functions ng butlers at saka ng supply points, no, affects their operating profit, no? Okay. The supply points and the butlers had performed manufacturing and distribution functions in the NART beverage business, and both sold their products at the wholesale level. Petitioner contends that the butlers were marketing-light businesses, whereas the supply points assertedly had marketing-intensive operations. Yun yung sinasabi ng Coke. Pero sa totoo lang, paano ka mag-marketing-intensive operations? Eh, yung sinusupplyan mo, license na rin ng Coke. No? So the evidence at trial showed that butlers in the aggregate paid about as much for trade marketing annually as TCCC and its affiliates together paid for consumer marketing. And the latter contention is simply inaccurate, no? So inaccurate kasi sabi niya malaki daw yung marketing intensive operations daw ang supply points. So paano ka marketing intensive points yung customer mo are licensed butlers, no? Hindi open market. The supply points did not have marketing intensive operations. So yung allegation ng Coke na may marketing intensive operations daw ang supply points, pinabulaanan talaga yan ng court. Ano sabi ng court? The supply points, no? Word for word yan. Kung baga sa harap-harapan, parang sinampal talaga sa mukha mo na, hindi totoo yung sinasabi mo, no? So the supply points didn't have marketing intensive operations because apart from the Brazilian supply point, they engage in no marketing operations. Wala nga silang marketing operations. All consumer marketing activities were undertaken by the TCCC and the serve cost, no? Sino yung gumagawa ng marketing activities? Yung the Coca-Cola company at saka itong mga service companies, no? The supply points simply had this cost charged to their books via intercompany accounting. No? So in assessing the comparability of the butlers and the supply points, sino yung kino-compare natin dito sa Coke? The butlers and the supply points. No? So yun na yung pag gumagawa tayo ng transfer pricing analysis at saka mga related parties yan. So meron na tayong tested party. No? Sino yung tested party dito? The supply points. At sino yung comparables dito? Yung butlers, no? Yan yung pag-analyze natin sa related parties transactions among the group. So we focus on the economic functions they actually perform and the risk they actually assume, not on intercompany charges made by their parent, no? So petitioner experts. Sino yung petitioner dito? The Coca-Cola. Nag-hire din siya ng expert, no? Si IRS nag-hire din ng expert, yun si Dr. Nyolon. Si Coca-Cola also hired an expert. Develop various financial ratios involving revenue, inventory, asset turnover, fixed assets, and marketing expenses. So gumawa din siya ng ratio, yung expert ng Coke, no? In an effort to show that the supply points were not comparable to the butlers. Kasi ayaw nila, din-dispute nila yung transfer pricing analysis na kino-compare yung supply points to butlers, no? So ayaw nila. Some of these computations relied on questionable assumptions. So yun yung sabi nila, questionable assumptions daw na i-compare mo yung butlers at saka yung supply points. Sino nga yung butlers dito? Yung gumagawa na ng Coke, no? Sino yung supply points dito? Yung gumagawa ng concentrate na sinusupply sa butlers. Okay. For example, Dr. Timothy Liverman calculated that the supply points receivable represented 33% of their adjusted total assets. No? So yung accounts receivable. Whereas the comparable figure for the butlers was 15%. No? So yung receivable daw ng supply points, 33%, yung sa butler, 15% lang. No? But as Dr. Nyolon noted, the receivables shown by the supply points may include items that were not trade-related and or settled in the ordinary course of business under normal commercial terms. No? So both experts nagpa-anuhan na ng kanilang findings. Ano sabi ng expert ng Coke? Mas malaki daw yung accounts receivable ng supply point. Dinastify naman ng expert ng IRS na yung kanyang accounts receivable includes non-trade related, no? So hindi in the course of business operation, no? Okay. Dr. Leverman calculated that marketing expenses as a percent of net revenue was 30% for supply points and 20% for butlers. Imagine, hindi mo talaga ma-fathom, no, ma-explain. Bakit ang marketing expenses ng supply points mas malaki pa sa marketing expenses ng butlers, no? ang supply points 30% yung kanyang marketing expenses, while yung supply points yung supply points 30%, yung butlers 20%, no? Samantalang ang butlers nagma-market na siya doon sa non-related na mga consumer. Samantalang si supply points non-related lang ang market niya, no? So parang baligtad, no? Parang walang sense, no? Walang economic substance. But as noted previously, this ratio is not meaningful for the supply points because they did not themselves engage in significant marketing activities. O kaya nga yung supply points is not engaged in marketing activities. So bakit ang laki ng kanyang marketing expenses, no? So they simply had marketing cost assigned to them. So ano pala yun? Yung marketing cost ina-assign lang sa kanila, hindi talaga sila mga marketing expenses, no? So because petitioner had complete discretion in deciding how many dollars of marketing cost would be assigned to each supply point, these numbers have no grounding in operational reality. Oh, laki na ng findings agad, no? Bakit? Wala naman talagang direct marketing cost na ang supply point, no? Ina-assign lang sa kanya. Dr. Leverman also calculated that the net revenue as a percentage of adjusted asset and PPE was much higher for the supply points than for butlers. No? Okay, so ano yung PPE? Mas higher ang supply points, no? Kaysa butlers. But these ratios have a question-begging aspect to them. Kaya nga, questionable. The supply points net revenue consisted chiefly of the concentrate price paid by butlers. But by paying the concentrate price, the butlers secured not only the physical beverage base, but also the entire package of rights and privileges they needed to operate efficiently as Coca-Cola butlers. So ano yun? Kasama na doon sa binili nilang concentrate, yung right to use the intangibles. So, noting the transferred property may include intangible property, embedded intangible property. So, yun na yun. And ano yun? Intangible property, embedded intangible property. Nandun kasama na nung binili mo yung concentrate. This package included the right to use TCC trademarks, access to TCCC approved suppliers, access to critical databases, no? So may access na to critical databases, kasama na yung trademarks, no? May mga approved suppliers na, expectation of ongoing consumer marketing support from TCC and the served cost. So kasama na doon sa pagbili mo ng concentrate. In short, the net revenue received by the supply points was artificially inflated because it represented compensation to petitioner for its intangible contribution as well as to the supply points for their manufacturing activity, no? So inflated yung net revenue ng supply points, no? Inflated, pinalaki. Since the supply points net revenue was artificially inflated, no? So ang ganda ng term niya na ginamit, no? Artificially inflated. Pinalaki, parang balloon, no? Pina-inflate. Financial ratios with net revenue in the numerator do not furnish useful evidence in judging the supply points comparability to the butlers. No? So, hindi talaga sila comparable. Indeed, the objective of this transfer pricing exercise is to ascertain an arm's length division of concentrate revenue between petitioner and the supply points. No? So, ang totoo, supply points comparability to butlers, hindi talaga siya. No? But, ano yung purpose? Bakit nagkaroon ng transfer pricing analysis na sila yung ginamit na comparables? To a certain arm's length division of concentrate revenue between petitioner and the supply points. No? Sino yung petitioner? The Coca-Cola. Patayin mo nga sandali yung aircon sa kabila. No? Masakit yung tiyan ko malamig. Okay. If Dr. Leverman had used net revenue less arm's length royalty as the numerator in his ratios, those ratios would look very different, no? So financial ratios can be useful, no? But depending on which ratios one chooses and what assumptions and adjustment one makes, they can be used to support rather different conclusions. At the end of the day, we did not find the financial ratios constructed by petitioners experts to have much probative value in determining the butler's comparability to the supply points. Comparability under the regulations is principally judged on the basis of functions performed, no, contractual terms, risks assumed, economic conditions, and assets employed. We have focused the butlers highly comparable to the supply points in all 5 respects. Although concededly there are differences between the two sets of companies, we find on balance that these differences tend to make the butlers deserving of a higher ROA than the supply points. So ano yung na-prove nila dito? The butlers deserve a higher return on assets than the ROA, than the supply points. Pero doon sa study na pinakita kanina, sobrang laki yung mga profits ng supply points. To the extent, Dr. Newlon, comparable profit method will tend to overcompensate rather than to undercompensate the supply points, and it is therefore conservative. No? Kaya conservative pa rin yung use of the comparable profit method. Data assumptions and comparability adjustments. So, since nag-compare na tayo, ano na yung kasunod, no? When we are doing a transfer pricing audit, ano yung kasunod after na nagkaroon na tayo ng identify na tayo na meron na tayong comparability analysis at analyze na natin yung mga comparability factors, the next is comparability adjustment, no? So, respondent has gone a long way toward establishing the reasonableness of his transfer pricing methodology by showing that the tested activity is highly susceptible to a CPM or comparable profit method, and that the tested parties' supply points and uncontrolled comparables independent Coca-Cola bottlers engaged in similar business activities under similar circumstances. No? However, we cannot conclude that his results are reasonable without reviewing the selection and quality of his data and the assumptions employed to bridge any gaps in those data. No? So we must also ensure that the commissioner applied the CPM in a manner that account for all of the supply points relevant business activity. No? So dito itong discussion natin ngayon, no, will revolve around explanations ng IRS kung paano nila ginawa yung transfer pricing analysis. No? Kasi pagdating sa role ng accountant in doing the transfer pricing documentations, ito yung i-answer natin. No? We have to see to it that our transfer pricing analysis report can stand scrutiny by the tax authority. Ang ibig lang sabihin, kahit mag-conduct pa ng transfer pricing audit, your documentation will support your contention, no? Kasi in this case ng Coca-Cola hindi, no? Ang daming findings dito. And one of the findings here is the split invoicing. Kaya ang ganda ng pagkagawa nila dito, no, na explain dito yung split invoicing kung paano siya ginawa ng Coke, no? Na isang dahilan yan kung bakit nagkaroon ng findings ang IRS, no? Okay. Although kakaunti na rin, pero ano pa isang ano pa to. Pero mga explanations na lang naman, no? So, let's see na matapos natin to ngayon. Kasi, meron na akong piniprepare na next case na i-discuss ko sa inyo Yung Agra City, no? Versus, ano ngayon, Hari?
Canada.
Ha?
Canada.
Versus Canada, yung Canadian Revenue Agency, CRA, no? Farm naman yun, mga farm products, no? So, pero maganda din yun kasi doon naman talo yung tax authority doon. No? And it's a good case to discuss also. No? Okay, so tuloy natin. Anong oras na?
Ano po man 1 hour 20 minutes.
So, meron pa tayong 40 minutes. So, sana matapos natin yung Coke para next, kailan yung next natin? Monday?
Ako.
Ma-discuss natin yung Agra City, no? Versus Canadian Revenue Agency. Mas maganda doon kasi yung din-discuss doon yung transfer pricing adjustment, yung sham transactions, no? Yung recharacterization, yun yung mga issues doon, no? Dito sa ano naman, sa Coca-Cola, ito yung adjustment ng payment of royalty, no? Assignment of income, at saka yung dito yung mga contractual terms, no? Na hindi naaayon. Okay. So, okay, tuloy po tayo, no? We cannot conclude, sabi ng court dito, that these results are reasonable without reviewing the selection and quality of his data and the assumptions employed to bridge any gaps in those data. We must also ensure that the commissioner applied the CPM in a manner that accounts for all of the supply points relevant business activity. Kasi since transfer pricing is economic taxation, transfer pricing deals with the economic activity of the client or of the taxpayer, no? Kaya napaka-powerful ng transfer pricing. Selection of butlers. In preparing the audit report, Dr. Newlon researched multiple databases for companies whose primary function was the production and bottling of Coca-Cola trademark beverages. He began by searching for companies classified under either of two standard industrial classification SIC codes, no? So 2086 bottled and canned soft drinks and carbonated waters, and 2087 flavoring extracts and flavoring syrups not elsewhere classified. He supplemented that search by reviewing 284 additional companies identified in bottler agreements with TCCC or listed as members of bottling associations, the American Beverage Association and the Coca-Cola Bottlers Association. The search generated 508 bottlers for consideration. Dr. Newlon eliminated companies that primarily bottled non-Coca-Cola products that produce alcoholic beverages, no? Or in which TCC held a controlling interest. He also eliminated companies that lacked audited financial statements for 2007 to 2009. No? Actually, may nagtanong sa akin nito na, Ma'am, pwede ba nating gawing comparables? Ang ginagawa niya is 2020. Tapos yung data na gagamitin niya is 2015, 2016 because wala daw available na data yung comparables. Ang sabi ko, in that case, pagka wala available information yung comparables, you have to disregard it as comparable, no? You have to reject it as comparable. Hindi pwede kasi wala information. No? Matatalo ka doon pagka ginamit mo yung comparables na yun. Or otherwise had insufficient data to perform a ROA. After receiving business description, yung ating Hari, yung transfer pricing analysis natin, start na tayo doon sa dalawa. Kaya mag-ano na tayo ng mga comparables niyan sa easy. Ganap. Okay. Or otherwise had insufficient data to perform a ROA. No? After reviewing business descriptions of its company, yan, business description. Saan natin kukunin yan business description? Sa US, Forms 10K or annual reports and other financial information. Yung manggagaling yan sa financial statements, no? So, Dr. Newlon ultimately selected 18 independent Coca-Cola bottlers, headquartered in 10 countries but with operations on every continent except Antarctica. Biro mo, sa Antarctica, di ba sobrang lamig na doon? May Coke pa pala. Di ba nandoon yung ano yung mga penguins, no? Na lumulubog sa ice, no? Sobrang kapal ng kanilang mga balahibo, no? Antarctica. His list included the 4 largest Coca-Cola bottlers in the world. No? Ito yung CCE, Hellenic, Coca-Cola, FEMSA, and Coca-Cola Amatil. No? Observing that butlers doing business in Latin America tended to have high ROAS and that butlers doing business in East Asia tended to have low ROAS, Dr. Nyolon segmented the 18 butlers into geographic regions to avoid bias when making comparison with supply points. No? So ito na, magsisegmentize ka talaga kasi kahalimbawa niyan, nationwide, ay worldwide, yung scope ng comparability mo. These regions have different economic conditions. So you have to segmentize and then explain its region, no? Kung ano yung naging operations nila doon and the economic conditions. Kaya ang scope ng study pagka worldwide mas malaki, kaya yun ang mahal ang singil, no? Millions of dollars, millions of pounds. Okay. Observing that butlers doing business in Latin America tended to have high ROAS and that butlers doing business in East Asia tended to have low ROAS. Dr. Newland segmented the 18 butlers, no? So, ni-require niya. Kaya ito yung sabi ko sa mga accountant ng mga companies na be prepared or be ready with your segmented financial information, no? To avoid bias when making comparison with the supply points. In his audit report, he calculated ROAS for those 18 butlers as follows, no? So ito yung mga segment, no? And then the interquartile range or ROA or the return on assets from 2007 to 2009, no? Anong nakikita niyo dito? The percentage is 25 to 75%, no? And then they compute the median. Anong sabi ng dito ng OECD? When using the interquartile range of the ratio, kasi in this case, ROA yung ginagamit na ratio, the 25th to 75th percentile is still acceptable, no? Kaya ang ginamit dito, 25 to 75, no? So, for the butler segment, all butlers, 25th percent and then the 75th percent, no? And then the non-East Asian butlers, 13 in numbers. Latin American butlers, 6. Non-East Asian butlers outside Latin America is 7, no? So, yung 25th percentile nila, and then the median and the 75th percent, no? After retaining Dr. Newland as an expert witness for trial, respondent asked him to consider possible refinement to his methodology as new information became available during discovery. Halimbawa, supply points data and additional butler financial statements. Kasi hindi ito nila ipinakita previously, no? But during the trial, may mga information sila available, no? After reviewing this data, Dr. Newland selected 6 additional butlers and calculated for them ROAS as available as follows. So, during the review, no, ng case, may nadagdag ulit na ilan to? 6, no? 6 additional butlers from China, Japan, and then 4 sa Spain, no? So, operating income to net revenue and then the operating assets ratio over net revenue. So, ito na yung ROA, no? Ito na yung ROA nila. A minus B, no? A divided by B. Okay. So, Beijing Coca-Cola beverage, ang ROA niya is 13%. Coca-Cola Central Japan, 4.7%. Spain, 20.9%, 14.8%, 14.6%, and then 13.3%. Adding these results to the result for the initial 18 butlers, Dr. Newland calculated geographically segmented median ROAS as follows. So ito na yung bago niya, no? 15.8 and then 18%. Petitioner does not contend that Dr. Newland erred in the search process he employed, nor does petitioner challenge the representativeness of Dr. Newland's 24 butler sample or the reliability of the data he extracted from butler financial statements. Hindi nila challenge yung gawa ni Dr. Newland, no? Kasi usually pagka court na yan, yung opposing lawyers mo, always it's a challenge yung expert witness, no? findings. We conclude that Dr. Newland's 24 butler sample is reliable and fairly represent the universe of independent butlers engaged principally in the business of bottling and distributing TCC branded products. Para sa akin, ang next nito, because appeal na naman nila to sa Supreme Court, no? Kasi nasa appeal pa lang to. Ang nakikita ko dito na next move nila, talagang i-question nila itong para ma-discard itong findings ni Dr. Newlon, no? So, bahala na yung mga lawyers dyan. Battle of the brain nito, no? So, computational adjustment. To implement the CPM, Dr. Newlon needed to calculate the ratio of operating profit to operating assets. No? So, for the supply points and the butlers in his sample, financial statements provide a logical starting point for calculating these numbers. No? Kaya hari yung mga financial statements ng comparables. Umpisa na naman tayo, hindi na pwede yung ginagawa natin dati na kukunin muna, i-compute muna yung mga ratio bago natin kunin yung financial statements. Ngayon, buo. No? Buo yan. Tagpa 500 ang bayad per financial statement. Financial statements provide a logical starting point for calculating these numbers, but adjustments are typically required for differences between the tested party and an uncontrolled taxpayer. So, in terms of the respective accounting practice, no? So, yun yung computational adjustment, no? Okay. Ano yung ginawa dito ni Dr. Newlon? Ratio of operating profit to operating assets, or in short, the ratio on operating assets. So, yun yung income, no? O yung income mo, i-divide mo sa operating assets. No? Bakit? Kasi yung operating assets mo, yun yung ginagamit mo for the production. Doon ka nag-i-invest ng pera mo kasi yun yung kailangan. No? Operating assets means the value of all assets used in the relevant business activity of the tested party, including fixed assets and current assets. No? So, kasama na yung cash equivalents, accounts receivable, and inventories. No? So, assets not used in the relevant business activity include investment in subsidiaries, excess cash, and portfolio investments. Operating assets may be measured by their net book value or by their fair market value, provided that the same method is applied consistently. No? Sa accounting, ito yung measurement ng operating assets, but for BIR purposes, at cost lang po. No? Kaya, once na nag-prepare tayo, isa pa pala yan, hari, ipapakita natin during the tax prepare seminar natin, yung reconciliation. How do we reconcile the accounting income and the taxable income? Why? Especially sa mga recognition ng mga operating assets, halimbawa, sa computation ng depreciation, we only use the cost, no? The cost method, hindi yung fair value method as required by the accounting standards. Okay. So, as permitted by the regulations, Dr. Newlon calculated operating assets by using the net book value figures reported by the butlers and the supply points, no? So, actually, dito sa expert na hired ng IRS, Dr. Newlon, actually, wala naman siyang ginawa dito eh. Just apply the formula to get the ratio, no? So, for each year, he arranged prior year and current operating assets as reported by each entity. Petitioner does not contend that Dr. Newlon applied the book value approach inconsistently. So, hindi nila ma-question yung ginagawa ni Dr. Newlon, which is the expert witness ng IRS. And we conclude that this approach was reasonable. No? Kasi hindi naman kina-question ng Coke. So when preparing his initial audit report, Dr. Newlon did not have complete information concerning the supply points receivables from affiliated entities. He accordingly increased its supply point operating assets by an estimate of intra-company accounts receivable, assuming that such revenues were payable to the supply points within 30 days. He computed net operating assets for the supply points and the butlers by subtracting from total operating assets items they identified on their financial statements as non-operating assets. Before finalizing his expert witness report, Dr. Newlon received Data concerning the supply points, intracompany receivables as shown on petitioner's books. He concluded that the receivables as shown may include items that were non-trade related and or settled in the ordinary course of business under normal commercial terms. Nabagit na to kanina, no, na yung receivables ng supply points, kasi ginawa nilang justification nga na mas malaki yung receivable ng supply points. So, ibig sabihin, dapat mas malaki yung rewards niya kasi may risk siya sa receivable. Pero ang sabi naman ni Dr. Nyolon, the expert of IRS, na non-trade or non-commercial in terms yung nandyan sa supply points na receivables, no? Okay. The book value approach may undervalue long-held assets that have appreciated. This effect is non-existent or negligible for cash and accounts receivable. Although land buildings, other PPE may have appreciated, it would be difficult to determine the fair market value of these items for 24 foreign butlers and 7 foreign supply points for each of 3 separate years. Since the butlers had relatively larger investment in PPE, any understatement of their operating assets owing to the use of book value would increase the ROA and thus benefit petitioner, yung Coca-Cola. No? So, the receivables include items that were not trade-related and or settled in the ordinary course of business under normal commercial terms. So, in other words, Dr. Nyolon concluded that a portion of the supply points reported receivables did not constitute operating assets, no? Kasi non-trade related siya. So, anong ibig niyan sabihin? Hindi yun mag-constitute ng operating assets because they were not used in the relevant business activity of the tested party, not used in business, no? So, he accordingly adhered to the approach of his initial audit report, estimating receivables from affiliates by assuming 30-day payment terms for the supply points, receipt of intra-company revenue. So we consider the approach to be reasonable. In his expert witness report, Dr. Nyolon stated that his updated computations following inclusion of 6 additional butlers incorporated minor differences in the definition of the supply points, operating assets as compared with his original audit report. Specifically, the operating assets of the Brazilian supply point were increased by about 3%. No? So the operating assets of the Mexican supply point were decreased by about 2%. And the operating assets of the other 5 supply points were unchanged. Because Dr. Nyolon did not explain the basis or justification for these revisions, we cannot evaluate them. No? We will accordingly resolve doubts in petitioners' favor by adopting Dr. Nyolon's increased operating asset figure for the Brazilian supply point, but not his reduced operating asset figure for the Mexican supply point. Operating profit, no? So, dito na tayo sa operating profit. Anong oras na, Hari? Kasi isama ko yung sa discussion ngayon yung split invoicing, no? Kasi, yun yung pinaka-importante eh.
138 minutes.
Okay. So, kaya pa to. Ito yung lang yung pinaka-importante kasi ito yung pinaka-highlights na findings ng IRS, no? Okay. So, let us see kung matapos natin ngayon kasi nandito naman yung gist talaga ng kaso eh. No? Okay. Yun, may mga setting aside pa ng contract terms eh, no? And also the discussion on the economic substance, no? Okay. Hindi talaga siguro kaya ngayon, no? Sige. Operating profit. Ano naman itong operating profit as discussed? Means gross profit, sales revenue less cost of goods sold reduced by operating expenses, no? So operating expenses include all expenses not included in cost of goods sold except for interest expense, income taxes, and any other expenses not related to the operation of the relevant business activity Operating expenses generally include expenses associated with advertising, promotion, sales, marketing, warehousing and distribution, administration, and reasonable allowance for depreciation and amortization. Yung palang transfer pricing analysis natin, pwede mo nang i-download, may mga partial documents na silang pinadala. Nakita mo? Yes, ilagay mo sa folder bukas. Certain items reported as operating income or expense, extraordinary gains and losses, gain or loss on the sale of PPE, or embedded restructuring expenses, often do not relate to continuing operations and are thus generally excluded when performing these calculations. Ang daming dinis-allow, no, na hindi sinama sa computation. No? Treatment of restructuring expenses in the application of CPM. For the most part, Dr. Newland computed operating profit by adapting the classification of items as reported on the supply points and the butler's income statements. So for the supply points, he reclassified some items and made certain adjustments to earnings and profits. No? So yung nag-reclassify siya. For the butlers, he generally excluded from operating expenses any separately stated amortization, stock options expense. So stock option, actually, talagang daming transfer pricing issues dyan. And other items that do not necessarily reflect operational cost. Petitioner has not assigned error to these calculations and we find them reasonable. Kasi ang mga gawa ni Dr. Newland, the expert of IRS, hindi na kine-question ng Coca-Cola. No? Kasi bakit? Reasonable. Dr. Newland also added to operating income both for the supply point and for the butlers imputed interest on their non-interest-bearing liabilities, such as accounts payable. As Dr. Newland observed, non-interest-bearing liabilities can represent a source of financing for which there is no explicit interest charge. No? So ano yung NIBL? Non-interest-bearing liabilities. Okay. Okay. So, NIBLs can represent a source of financing for which there is no explicit interest charge. Okay, so non-interest bearing. So, wala siyang interest charges. He also observed that the butlers and the supply points had differing practices regarding payment terms, both as to their volume of accounts payable and the lag time before they made payment. The regulations recognize the need for adjustment to account for such differences. No? Income tax regulations requiring an adjustment to reflect the difference in payment terms. No? Example, requiring adjustment to operating profit for differences in accounts receivable. Say generally compact computer corporation versus commissioner, no? Approving adjustment for differences in payment terms. Specifically, Dr. Newland reclassified as non-operating income or expense, no? Any net gain or loss on the sale of PPE or other assets and any separately stated restructuring expense. Reclassified minor amounts of fees and commission income and certain rental income as operating income. Reclassified reported royalty expense, license fees, fee expense, company-owned property rental expense, and fees and commissions expense as operating expenses. So, nag-classify siya ng mga non-operating income and expense. Okay. To avoid distorting the operating income comparison between the butlers and the supply points, Dr. Newland estimated the total cost of carrying NIBL's non-interest-bearing liabilities for its butler and supply point and added the amount to its entity's operating income. In effect, he treated all entities as if they had operated with zero-day payment terms, then added to their operating income the imputed interest savings. Also, the regulations specifically permit this manner of adjustment. No, where there are material differences in accounts payable among the comparable parties and the tested party, it will generally be appropriate to adjust the operating profit of its party by increasing it to reflect an imputed interest charge on its party's accounts payable. To calculate the imputed interest charge, Dr. Newland applied a local cost of funds rate to its entity's average volume of outstanding non-interest-bearing liabilities. So for purposes of determining the supply points average intercompany payables, he assumed 30-day payment terms, an assumption that we approve, no? So siguro pagdating sa Supreme Court, itong mga assumptions nila dito will be disputed, no? Kasi although sa transfer pricing, critical assumptions are acceptable, no? Pero that can always be challenged. We conclude that Dr. Newland's calculations for determining non-interest-bearing liabilities adjustment to operating profit as set forth in this expert witness report are reasonable as applied both to the butlers and to the supply points. Implementation of the CPM or ROA. Dr. Newland made two further refinements in implementing his CPM ROA. First, he observed that the ROAs earned by the butlers varied somewhat by geography, no? Yung return on assets. Most Latin American butlers had ROAs above 30%, whereas most East Asian butlers had ROAs below 10%, no? Rather than computing a single median ROA for all butlers, Dr. Newland calculated geographically segmented butlers' ROAs, which the IRS applied to supply point from similar regions. We agree with Respondent that applying geographically segmented ROAs improves the reliability of the CPM. Butlers in East Asia and Japan in particular appear to have been subject to local economic conditions or financial reporting rules that reduce their ROAs as compared to butlers outside East Asia. In his expert witness report, Dr. Newland made several technical revisions to his non-interest-bearing loans computations for the supply points by computing the Irish supply points cost of funds using a reference rate for Ireland in particular instead of an EU-wide rate. This adjustment generated very slight upward revisions to annual operating profits for the Chilean and Irish supply points and somewhat larger downward revisions to annual operating profits for the Brazilian, Costa Rican, and Swazi supply points. We find no fault with this adjustment which were slightly favorable to petitioner in the aggregate, no? So yung ginawa ni Dr. Newland, favorable pa siya sa Coca-Cola, no? Hindi nag-object yung court or sinustain siya ng court, no? So butlers in Latin America tended to have much higher ROAs attributable in part to local accounting rules and apparently to having a more atomized retail customer base. To avoid distortion, the IRS implemented Dr. Newland's recommendations by using the median ROA of the Latin American butler segment to adjust the income of the Brazilian, Chilean, Costa Rican, and Mexican supply points. Actually, ito yung findings talaga dito na dinisallow, yung sa Brazilian, Chilean, Costa Rican, and Mexican supply points. Why? Because they are composed of 85%, no, ng sales ng Coke. And the IRS eliminated the East Asian butlers kasi ang baba ng gross profit ng East Asian butlers, no, with their low ROAs, no. When calculating the median ROA for adjusting the income of the Irish and Swazi supply points, as compared with using a uniform ROA for all supply points, these refinements were conservative in that they benefited petitioner. All in all, we conclude that respondents' geographically segmented ROAs were reasonable. Ano oras na?
1 hour 49.
10 minutes na lang, no? Okay. So, Dr. Newland's second set of refinements addressed the question of non-TCC branded beverages, no? So, although the vast bulk of supply points activity consisted of manufacturing concentrate for TCC branded beverages, several supply points, in particular the Brazilian supply point, owned the rights to other products, many of which were sold locally. As compared to TCCC global brands, the supply points often made significant contributions to these local brands and owned the intangible assets used in producing such beverages. Dr. Newlon correctly concluded that the CPM should not be used to reallocate to TCC any supply point income attributable to these local brands because no TCC intangibles were employed in generating this income. Dr. Newlon thus agreed that the supply points were entitled to keep the income generated by the intangible assets connected to brands they owned. When he prepared his initial reports, however, he lacked sufficient data to extract reliably from his CPM the income and assets attributable to brands legally owned by the supply points. No? Two of petitioner's experts, Dr. Krag, petitioner, ibig sabihin yung experts ng Coca-Cola, no? Si Dr. Krag and si Mr. Robert Wentland supplied the needed data. Mr. Wentland identified and extracted assets and income attributable to beverages whose trademarks were owned by Atlantic, which held the Costa Rican, Egyptian, Irish, and Swazi supply points. Pero yung Atlantic also owned by Coca-Cola, no? Similarly, Dr. Krag identified and extracted from the revenue base of the Brazilian supply points revenues from brands of which it or other non-US entity was the registered owner. So, kaya yun ang maganda na you will be required to prepare a segmented financial statement or segmented reports. Kasi in this case, since yung Brazilian company, may mga kasama doon sa sales niya, yung mga non-Coca-Cola brand na beverages, pinatanggal, no? Hindi sinama doon sa total. Okay. Dr. Newlon ultimately accepted this data. In-accept naman nung expert ng IRS, no? Yung binigay na data or information ng expert ng Coca-Cola. So in extracting revenue attributable to trademarks owned by the supply points, his final calculations assume that the excluded brands, which were mostly local and less competitive, had the same profitability as TCC highly profitable brands. These assumptions appears reasonable, indeed conservative, no? Mas favorable ngayon sa Coke. We will accordingly instruct the parties. Ang daming lamukari, no? In their rule 155 computations to adjust the allocation of income. Ang tapang nila no? To adjust the allocation of income set forth, malalaki sila, set forth in the notice of deficiency to exclude sa income attributable to trademarks owned by the supply points as identified by petitioner experts and accepted by Dr. Newlon. No? So in sum, we conclude that the commissioner did not abuse. So ito yung sabi ng court na the commissioner, ibig sabihin yung IRS, did not abuse his discretion in reallocating income from the supply points to petitioner by use of the Butler CPM. No? So, tama daw yung commissioner. Petitioner has not carried its burden of showing that such determination was purely arbitrary. No? So, Asiatic Petroleum Company, and because there is substantial evidence supporting the determination, it must be affirmed. No? So, in-affirm siya. Okay. We will accordingly sustain the reallocations of income determined in the notice of deficiency, subject to the adjustment noted in the preceding pages to our holdings elsewhere in this opinion. So we are hopeful that the parties can work out the granular level calculations in the Rule 115 computation. To the extent they are unable to do so, they may seek further guidance from the court. Anong oras na? Kasi ang sunod natin split invoicing, pero ayokong ibitin kasi ang split invoicing, no? Kasi ito yung major na findings po ng 54. So 6 minutes, pwede pa. Pwede pa, no? I will explain to you the split invoicing. At paano ginawa ng Coca-Cola yung split invoicing, no? So, we now turn to responding split invoicing allocations. Paano niya ginawa, in-split niya yung invoice. In his amended answer, respondent reallocated an additional 385 million of income to petitioners. Sino yung petitioner? The Coca-Cola from 6 service companies, no? Sino yung 6 service companies? Ito yung in charge ng local advertising and marketing, no? That benefited from split invoicing during 2007 to 2009. Kaya yun yung sinasabi ko sa inyo na be ready with your segmented financial reports because dito sa segmented financial reports from both the supply points and the service companies, dito nakikita yung split invoicing, no? These reallocations produced additional deficiencies totaling 135 million. This is another findings, no? Respondent bears the burden of proof on this issue. Sino yung respondent? Yung petitioner dito, Coca-Cola. So, sino ang may burden of proof in this issue? The IRS, no? Where split invoicing was employed, a supply point, no? So, paano ginawa yung split invoicing? A supply point invoiced the butler for a portion of the concentrate. Sino dapat yung nag-supply ng concentrate? Si supply point. So, pag nag-invoice siya, dapat lahat ng benta niya sa concentrate, kasi siyang may-ari ng inventory, dapat invoice niya lahat ng concentrate price. Pero anong ginawa niya? Dinivide niya between the supply point and the local servco, no? So, issued a separate invoice to the butler for the remainder of the concentrate price. So ano yung split invoicing? Sino nag-split? Si supply point and then si servco, no? Inaati nila yung sales. Samantalang wala namang participation dapat si servco doon sa sales. As a result of this practice, the participating supply points lost revenue, no? Sino nawala ng revenue? Si supply points, which was diverted to the servcos, na nag-split invoicing sila, dinivert yung sales kay servco, no? Actually, this is fraudulent, no? Fraudulent ito. Respondent determined that 6 servcos doing business in South America and Turkey received excess income as a result of this practice. That is income in excess of the cost plus compensation to which they were entitled under the normal contracts with export or TCC. Pero mo they're entitled to that income tapos binigay sa servco. Under their normal contracts with TCCC and export, servcos typically receive reimbursement but no markup on third-party expenses, no? Direct marketing expenses or DME and receive an average markup of 6% to 7% on cost other than DME. To calculate the arm's length compensation that the 6 servcos should have received from the butlers, Dr. Newlon initially assumed that its servco was entitled to a 7% markup on its non-DME cost, no? So, non-DME, non-direct marketing expenses. He further estimated that 31.7% of the servco's expenses were non-DME costs, attracting the 7% markup. In post-trial briefing, respondent appears to have adjusted these computations to reflect the markups actually appearing in the servco agreements, or if no markup was specified, an estimated markup of 5% on non-DME costs. He also made certain revisions to reflect updated financial data, no? So the services for which the servcos were compensated via split invoicing were indistinguishable from the services that they rendered directly to TCCC and export, no? Sino itong export? Also a subsidiary of Coca-Cola. Petitioner agrees that the servcos contracts with export and TCCC reflected arm's length terms. Petitioner accordingly concedes that the 6 servcos receive excess income from the butlers. Siyempre, excess income talaga kasi doon pa lang sa income ng supply points, doon na in-invoice sa servcos, no? And it does not appear to dispute the amounts of excess income as ultimately calculated by respondent, no? So magtataka ka dito, ang dami nilang hindi din-dispute. Pero palagay ko pagdating na yung papunta sa Supreme Court, doon na to sila argue, no? In its operating brief, petitioner agreed that split invoicing must be accounted for in determining the arm's length royalties payable by the supply points to TCCC, no? So in effect, petitioner contended that the supply point should be deemed to have received and should be allowed to retain the excess income derived by the servcos. In its answering brief, petitioner agrees that the court should address split invoicing in the manner in which the court addresses the main royalty issue. Kasi dalawang issues to, yung split invoicing at saka yung royalty issue. Ito yung in-adjust ng IRS, no? Na pinapabayad ng additional deficiency income tax ang Coca-Cola. So in deciding the main royalty issue, we have held that the arm's length compensation for the supply points is capped at the amounts calculated under the Commissioner Butler's CPM, comparable profit method. All income the supply points receive in excess of that benchmark must be reallocated to petitioner as additional royalties. No? So ito na, actually ito na yung decision ng court no? So to the extent the supply points are deemed to have received the excess income diverted to the 6 served cost, that additional income must likewise be reallocated to petitioner as additional royalties. No? So ano sabi dito ng court? Yung additional income must be reallocated to Coca-Cola as additional royalties. No? Or alternatively, as respondent contends, the served cost, excess income should be allocated to petitioner as royalties paid by the butlers for the use of petitioner's intangible property. So kaya pala natin itong tapusin kasi yung pinaka-gist ng case nandito na, no? Yung iba mga ano na lang yan mga explanations na lang yan no? On either theory, in short, the bottom line is the same, no? Since the extra income received by the 6 served cost was in excess of their arm's length income, no? And then nag-split invoicing pa sila. And since it cannot be allocated to the supply points without exceeding their arm's length income, it must necessarily be reallocated to petitioner as the owner of the valuable intangibles. Sino yung owner ng valuable intangibles? The Coca-Cola Company based in Georgia, Atlanta, which is the parent company. No? We thus hold that the respondent has carried this burden of proof with respect to split invoicing. No? We leave it to the parties in the Rule 155 computations to calculate the exact amount of the additional deficiency in a manner consistent with the evidence. So, magkano yung additional adjustment dito ng IRS for the Coca-Cola? Something like 135 million for the split invoicing. Okay, so ito naman yung petitioner's argument, no? On the supposed marketing intangibles, no? Petitioner principal contention is that the supply points owned immensely valuable off-book assets in the form of marketing intangibles that Dr. Newland neglected to consider when performing his CPM analysis. From this premise, petitioner derives two conclusions. First, it argues that the CPM was not an appropriate transfer pricing methodology because with respect to its transaction, both controlled parties, its supply point as well as petitioner allegedly contributed non-routine intangibles to the production of TCC trademark products. Second, if a Butler CPM were deemed appropriate, petitioner contends that their supposed marketing intangibles would have to be included among the supply points operating assets for purposes of performing the ROA computations, no? So, yung marketing intangibles, dapat daw kasama sa supply points operating assets. Petitioner acknowledges that TCC was the registered legal owner of virtually all of the trademarks and other intangible assets needed to manufacture and sell Coca-Cola, Fanta, Sprite, and other TCC trademark beverages in foreign market. But petitioner contends that these were in effect wasting assets. No? Wasting assets lang daw yun. What kept TCC's products fresh in consumer minds? Petitioner says were the billions of dollars spent annually on television, advertisements, social media, and other forms of consumer marketing. Without ongoing consumer advertising, the trademark secret formulas and proprietary manufacturing process owned by TCC would allegedly have suffered over time a hollowing out of value. So anong sabi ng Coke? Ang talagang nagbibigay daw ng value sa Coca-Cola yung kanyang advertising. Kasi kung wala daw yon, yung mga trademarks, mga formulas ng Coca-Cola, wala ng value. No? So, trademarks lose substantial value without adequate investment, management, marketing, advertising, and sales organization. Para sa akin, may point yung Coca-Cola. No? Petitioner accordingly urges that the court should look beyond TCC's legal ownership of these assets and focus instead on supposed marketing intangibles generated by the expenditure and advertising dollars, no? So Dr. Krag, one of the petitioner experts, referred to these supposed assets as marketing-related IP or IP associated with trademarks. Huh? So the company's consumer marketing in foreign markets was undertaken by the Servcos with assistance from third-party media and creative design firms. Ang problema lang dito, kahit anong allegations ng Coca-Cola, hindi magtutugma sa ang ginawa niya. Kasi bakit? Yung sinasabi niya, advertising yung nagpapalaki, no, ng marketing intangibles. Hindi naman ang may-ari doon yung supply points, no, ng marketing intangibles. And yet, nandoon kay supply points yung napakalaking income, no? So, either way, wala siyang, ano dito, walang points yung kanyang allegations, no? So, global marketing campaigns were conceived by headquarters in Atlanta, which distributed the material to the Servcos for customization to their local markets, no? At saka yung global marketing campaign, yung headquarters in Atlanta ang gumagawa, no? Kinakascade lang sa Servcos, no? For customization to their local markets. So under the charter model, HQ arranged for certain Servcos to take the lead in designing advertising content around holidays and sport events, then share this material with other Servcos. So most Servcos had contracts with Export, a domestic subsidiary of TCC. Export ito yung nag-expand yung Coca-Cola, no? All over the world. And they invoiced Export for marketing costs they incurred, no? So ito na naman chinarge nila si Export. BU, itong business unit leadership and finance personnel then initiated intercompany charges that placed on the books of its supply point, no? As they deem appropriate, an allocation portion of the sum that the Servcos had invoiced to Export. As explained, SOPRA 74, the amounts that's allocated to the supply points varied widely with no apparent relationship to these gross revenues. Oh. So how can you explain that? No, no apparent relationship to the gross revenues. Petitioner offered no clear explanation as to how this allocation methodology actually worked. Through this intercompany accounting, the supply points were charged allocated shares of the Servcos fees and commissions and third-party marketing expenses. The supply points played no role arranging consumer marketing and had no voice in selecting or evaluating the services for which they were thus made financially responsible. So in essence, they were passive recipient of charges that headquarters and business units leadership put on their books. So yung mga intragroup services or charges, no? Hindi na-explain. But because petitioners saw fit to put those charges on their books, petitioner experts assert that the supply points thereby acquired marketing intangibles worth tens of billions of dollars. Pero wala din kahit sa kanyang financial reports, no? We find no support for petitioner's argument in law, fact, economic theory, or common sense. Because transfer pricing is common sense, no? Yun yung sabi ng court dito. Wala raw common sense. These regulations explicitly state that legal ownership is the test for identifying the intangible. Kasi legal ownership, bakit? Protected yan by law, ang intangibles, no? And they are registered. To the extent the Servcos consumer advertising expenditures added value, those expenditures did not create new intangible assets owned by the supply points, no? Actually, wala talaga ditong participation ng supply points kasi yung kanya is manufacturing lang ng concentrate and then supply it to the licensed Coca-Cola bottlers, no? So wala siya wala siyang papel kahit doon sa mga marketing expenses para maging sellable ang Coca-Cola. Rather, the advertising enhanced the value of the trademarks and other intangible assets that were legally owned by TCCC. So in arguing that its unilateral allocation of cost-generated valuable intangible assets owned by the supply points, petitioner is attempting to create retroactively something resembling a cost-sharing arrangement of the sort permitted by other provisions of the regulations. Okay. But petitioner and supply points did not enter into a qualified cost-sharing arrangement. Yan yung sabi ko na ang ikakatalo dito ng Coke, yung absence of proper documentation, no? Kasi pwede siyang magiging qualified cost-sharing arrangement, pero wala naman silang cost-sharing arrangement na agreement. And this is simply not a cost-sharing case, no? So, okay. So, legal ownership na yung sunod. Anong oras na, Hari?
9 minutes po. 2 hours, 9 minutes.
Okay. So, more or less, yung mga sunod kasi na mga explanations dito, ano na lang parang parang related na rin doon sa mga na-discuss natin. So, ano ba talaga yung nangyari dito sa Coke na to? Ang adjustment, no? Nagkaroon ng adjustment yung IRS on the royalty payments paid by the supply points, no? Kasi yung supply points, sobrang laki ng kanilang gross profit or return on assets. Samantalang yung TCC, the Coca-Cola Company, mas maliit lang, mas malaki pa yung income earned ng or gross profit ng supply points na ang supply points napakasimple lang ang kanyang function. So anong ginawa dito ng IRS? In-adjust, no? Yung sum of the income attributed to the company, the supply points, pina-adjust, binigay sa the Coca-Cola Company as owner of the intangibles. So, binawasan yung income ng supply points, dinagdag sa Coca-Cola, no? Kasi as payment of royalty. Kasi bakit? Siya dapat yung malaki ang income kasi siya yung may-ari ng lahat ng intangibles, no? So, yun yung isang issue, yung payment of royalty, pina-adjust, and then yung split invoicing. O, paano nangyari yung split invoicing? Yung sales ng concentrate ng supply points, part lang dyan ang niresibuhan niya, yung part ang nagre-resibo na yung serve cost. When in fact, yung serve cost, wala siyang participation kasi advertising lang siya at saka marketing lang siya ng Coca-Cola. No? So, yun yung dalawang issues na talo yung Coca-Cola dito. But of course, this is just an appeal case. Magkakaroon pa ito ng another encounter siguro sa Supreme Court na. And then we will see kung ano yung maging resolution dito ng Supreme Court, no? But as of now, yun po yung mga nagiging issues ng Coca-Cola. So with that, I would like to say thank you, no? Yung susunod natin na discussion on the case of the Agra City versus the Canadian Revenue Agency, no? So kung pwede natin yun i-summarize na, no? Kasi dito talagang ayoko ma-miss ang ganda ng case ng Coca-Cola no? Pero yung mga susunod natin, i-summarize na natin and then i-discuss natin kung pwede bawat isang live streaming natin meron tayong isang case, no? Sa dami-dami na ng transfer pricing cases ng ng buong mundo decided by courts, no? Internationally. So mag-ano na tayo. But there are cases kasi na, just like may isang case dyan na 14 transfer pricing cases, of course, hindi natin matapos ng 2 oras, no? Just like in this Coca-Cola subsidiaries, saan tayo nagtagal dito? Doon sa corporate structure talaga ng organizations or how the Coca-Cola operates, no? Kasi doon talaga natin inilabas kung ano yung ginawa niya so that ano yung ginawa niya along the way that merits the reallocation of profits, no? Nung mga supply points companies niya. Okay? So with that, I would like to say thank you. Ilan na yung subscriber ng ano natin? Basic transfer pricing.
449.
Okay, so I would like to say thank you sa ating mga subscribers, no? Umabot na po tayo ng 449 subscribers. So, thank you very much. And let's call it a night, no? So, good evening, everyone.
Thank you daw, ma'am. Sabi ni Ma'am Lilia Fernando.
Okay, talaga masipag si, yan siya, Noreen Garcia siya, di ba?
Noreen Garcia.
Okay, so...
si Ma'am Lilian Yao.
Talagang mga masisipag yan no? So, shout out po sa inyo po, Ma'am Lilian Yao at saka Ma'am Lilia, no? Thank you very much, no? And good evening.